Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm hoping that we're live. I'm speaking from Bath in the UK, and I'm really delighted to have with me this morning, or rather the evening, Professor Garry Falloon, who is over in Sydney. So to first of all introduce us both, and then set the scene for our session this morning. So my name is Dr. Emma Pauncefort, and I am the founder of Delecti, an education consultancy based in the UK, and also the aegis under which I lead a new initiative called the Critical Literacy Project. And I'm super delighted, as I say, to have with me Professor Garry Falloon from Down Under. And Garry is the Director of International Engagement and Professor of STEM Education and Digital Learning in the Macquarie School of Education at Macquarie University in Sydney. And behind the scenes, if I may introduce my colleagues, Courtney Bonnet and Alex Grech, who are both connected to the Commonwealth Centre of Connected Learning in Malta. Alex is the director and Courtney supports. So thank you to my colleagues sat in London and Valletta. So before we get going, if I may set the scene for this session this morning. Our course, the Digital Literacy Lab for Educators, has now been running for a good 7 days, and I've really enjoyed engaging with colleagues from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, from Peru to Namibia, from Papua New Guinea to colleagues a little bit closer to myself over here in Europe. And the forum has been really abuzz with some very interesting questions and reflections and experiences being shared across time zones and different educational contexts. We've set up our first 7 days or so, really starting to interrogate what we mean by digital literacy. And the topic that we said we'd speak to this morning / this evening is the issue digital literacy as an essential 21st century skill. And before I hand over to Garry, I'd love to put a question mark at the end of that statement. Is digital literacy an essential 21st century skill? It's what we would like to explore, not just between ourselves, but also with you over the coming 50 minutes or so. A couple of housekeeping moments before we dive into all of the subject material. How we're going to run is we're trialing doing a fireside conversation. So the idea is that we will seek to spark some reflections and questions from yourselves through a few visuals and discussion for 10 to 15 minutes. And we invite you over that period to post reflections and comments in the YouTube chat. These will then be filtered back to myself and Garry, and we will seek to respond and answer to as many of your queries as possible. And just to finish off our session, I'll seek to sum up some of the issues and ideas and indeed follow-up moments before we close and we all get on with our days or indeed go to bed. So without further ado, I'd love at this point to hand over to Garry, whom I believe is going to give a little more introduction to himself, and then we will start with the visuals. So Garry, thank you so much again for taking time out of a very busy schedule in a very challenging moment, of course, for everyone working in any educational context. Thank you so much for your time. Really looking forward to hearing more about yourself and diving into the discussion.
Well, thank you, Emma, and thank you very much for the opportunity. And it's just terrific to be here and thinking that communicating with people right around the world in different time zones, different places, in different spaces. So welcome to you all, and thank you, Emma, for that really awesome introduction. I'm actually Macquarie University. Didn't quite get that one right, but I can excuse the accent for that one. And actually probably tell, I'm not too sure if you can, but I'm actually a Kiwi, I'm not an Australian. So I'm a new immigrant, or my family and I are new immigrants to Australia. I spent all of my life growing up in New Zealand, and I guess I haven't really followed the traditional kind of academic pathway, I suppose you could say. I'm a reasonably late comer to university life. I spent 22 years working in schools in New Zealand as a principal and as a primary teacher and a secondary teacher. Before I moved into working in corporate organisations, Telecom New Zealand. I was working for Microsoft and Partners in Learning. And I've been working for New Zealand Government, managing a range of very large-scale digital innovations projects as part of their digital capability development program in school. So I've really only been in universities, I suppose, in an academic sense for probably around 10 or 11 years. So I'm pretty new to it, and kind of bring a bit of a blend of corporate knowledge, educational kind of pragmatic classroom-based cut and thrust understanding of what works and what doesn't with kids and technology, and also a kind of mix of academic theory into the as well. So it's a really interesting question you've posed. Is digital literacy a 21st century competency? Well, I guess you can add to the list of competencies for the 21st century digital literacy. Is a pretty key component of that. The whole notion of, a 21st century competence and what it actually means is quite a contested concept. And if we look at the notion of digital literacy, we'll see that's equally contested. It comprises everything from multimodal literacy to computer literacy to information literacy, even internet literacy. And, I guess you could say all of these come under the umbrella of being digitally literate or digital literacies. And is it a 21st century competence? Well, it's interesting because if you read the discourse in industry and business, there's no doubt that digital skills are a very critical part of being able to function productively in the workplace. But I think we need to be a little careful that we just don't get driven totally by that kind of neoliberal economic imperative. And sort of frame up a competence as being more than something applicable just to the world of business or economy or industry. Being digitally literate or digitally competent, as I like to call it now, is far more encompassing than just a set of technical skills or a set of knowledges that you can apply to using different sorts of technologies or running different software packages or whatever. It's a very small part of it. It was really interesting. Before I came across to Australia, I actually went to a meeting which was held by the then CEO of one of New Zealand's largest software accounting firms, and she was talking about the people that they get from universities into their business. The firm was Xero. I don't know if you know of it. It's a very large multinational company that offers online accounting services. And she was saying, we get people coming to our business with excellent coding skills, with excellent technical knowledge of using software applications, but they can't talk to a customer and they can't talk to each other. So she said, our biggest problem is actually retraining the people that we get who have excellent technical capabilities to actually be able to put those capabilities into practice in a way that adds value to our company. She was still, naturally being a public listed company and being concerned with shareholder value, she naturally has, value added to the company as a key concern. But she highlighted a really important point. Being digitally literate in a technical sense isn't enough. The 21st century competencies are far broader, and they involve social skills, they involve thinking and metacognitive skills. They involve awareness and ethical attitudes towards people, environment, society, culture, and so on. I think for a long time, we've got ourselves hooked up in this whole kind of discourse of digital skills and digital literacy will somehow magically translate into economic and wealth value. And that's not the case. Well, it may be the case for a very small number of people. Those who have a vested interest in producing these devices that we, consume readily. But is that a fair and equitable distribution of the benefit of being digitally literate, or being able to put those practices into place? And I'm not too sure it is. So I think digital literacy, we can put under the umbrella all of those, those skills, the multimodal and so on. But I think it's a much broader concept than that. And I think we need to really challenge the prevailing kind of neoliberal discourse about, having economic imperatives as the key driver.
Interesting. So actually, we're already starting to question whether labels and definitions have a utility in essence, which is very interesting. Thank you, Garry.
Well, in academic discourse, you'd know that nobody agrees on anything.
Absolutely, absolutely. Keeps everyone on our jobs, right?
Oh, that's right. You've got to have a literacy associated with your area of interest. But, I think that, you can say that, but, in joking, but I think we just need to keep our eyes open and be critical, yeah?
Absolutely. So without further ado, perhaps we can go to our visuals to get into some of the nitty-gritty of how this conversation has been articulated or understood and fanned out into mainstream media. So here we go. I will come to share in 1 second. Speaking of technical skills, this is where we see it live in action. Okay. Excellent. Okay, so
yeah, we've got the first one here. I bet you everybody can guess who you could transplant the face of, a very prominent world, inverted commas, leader. Of course, this is dear old Pinocchio, who Carlo Collodi's 1883 fairy tale, the Italian writer. And of course, you know the story, Pinocchio, when Pinocchio tells a lie, his nose grows long. And this is, or grows longer. And this is really, I guess, a commentary on the, the current issues around, what is truth and how do we know truth, and, from fake news, fact from reality, fake from fiction. Sorry, truth from fiction. So that goes to the core, I think, of if you look at the competency set of information literacy, naturally encouraging learners and students to be critical in their interactions with information, to seek verification of what they understand or what they are told, to get it verified, obviously, but also not to just take everything at face value. I think now we've got so many parallel versions of reality floating around there, often perpetuated and disseminated by digital technologies that are in our pockets, that young people really do struggle to understand what is truth. How do we know what we're being fed is reality, or is it just somebody's version, or is it some version of reality that a particular individual wants us to believe for their own personal benefits?
Absolutely. And then we start to get into the realms of authority and whether the digital world has undermined our understanding of authority, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago, actually, done by a very skillful media commentator who observed President Trump's tactics of using digital media to disseminate fake, basically his version of the real news, our version of fake news. Mm-hmm. And she was saying, well, if you spread something far enough and wide enough and on it and often enough, people believe it because you are assumed in a position of power. And and Trump creates these false realities through very manipulative use of digital media. And, I'm not too sure whether he believes them himself. Sometimes I'm sure that he does believe them. But, it's a great example of, I don't like to use the word skillful, but it is quite skillful, but rather, deceptive use of digital tools, for pursuing political agenda.
And do you feel, Garry, that this is something that's particular to digital technologies, or is it that our digital capabilities now, it's just another technology that is enabling, perhaps like never before, the ability to create a truth or new truth and indeed reach more people?
Yeah, I think, back in the age of the Gutenberg printing press, people probably said the same thing. But, you know, the issue with digital tech is it's so much easier, it's so much more convenient, so much more instant, and it's so much more available. You know, more people have access to the information. So, you know, in it, tweets and retweets and, you know, postings on social media sites, this information, this often very false information is spread so quickly and so readily and so conveniently right across the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's you know, that's a great thing, you know, when it's used for positive purposes. But, you know, we've got to look at, this is a double-edged sword here. You know, the technology itself isn't necessarily in control of the way that the users interact with it. So it's, you know, the technology itself isn't value free. Obviously, it's a creation of, you know, particular sort of cultural view. But, you know, it's the way that people use it that makes it either you know, positive or negative.
Absolutely. And that question of speed, it's not, I suppose, just that we can access a huge portion of the population. Indeed, on Facebook, a third of the global population who are on Facebook. But I suppose it's also the flip side of that is that we as consumers, we're encouraged to consume and react so quickly, given that there's this flood of information perhaps coming to us.
Yeah, it also, you know, I mean, if you look on Facebook, you probably won't find me. I've got a profile there, I think it was set up in about 2014. I haven't touched it since, because I've become increasingly aware of what their company does, amongst others, with your data. And, you know, and I don't like it, and I don't appreciate that, so I don't use it, but I make that choice, you know, and that's my own choice, my personal choice, maybe to my, you know, professional detriment or whatever, but I understand that it's your implications of use of those sorts of platforms. You know, everything comes at a cost, you know, nothing is free. And, you know, it's, you know, you look at artificial intelligence and technologies like that and how they can, you know, harvest huge amounts of personal data and use it to target particular things at you, shopping, you know, preferences, you name it. You know, you're browsing around, you know, I'm looking forward to the day when, you know, I browse around for something online and I find it. I look forward to the day when the AI can tell that I've actually bought it and I don't need to receive, you know, same messages for about the next 3 months. So, you know, where's that data going and who's accessing it? And, you know, getting spam messages from companies you never interacted with. So, you know, their data has obviously been unsold. So, you know, I think one of the best things I've done, honestly, Emma, in the last month is unsubscribe from all those shopping forums, because they became so invasive and time consuming. But, you know, once again, that's a personal choice. And I guess that's something in terms of digital literacy that everybody has to work out what works best for them. You know, for some people that, you know, maybe that's quite an acceptable, you know, interaction with online. But for me personally, you know, I didn't think that was appropriate, and certainly I wasn't finding it helpful. So that was my choice.
Interesting. And it feels like we're getting into the realms of sort of digital management and also sort of individual empowerment as well, and feeling in a informed position to take decisions and start to, I suppose, curate and understand where to go online. Because it's one thing having access to all of this information and all these platforms and these services and these tools, but how do we sort of sift through and find what's actually bringing benefit to us or otherwise?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, and where does that benefit lie? You know, I think we've got to broaden that kind of notion of benefit away from, you know, just simply being so consumed with wealth creation, you know, and look at, you know, who benefits from my interaction with online. You know, could my impacts or my interactions have benefits for other people, other than those who create the websites? You know, and how can that interaction be, you know, tailored to that purpose? You know, I'm really concerned about, and I think this goes to my next slide, actually, Emma.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm actually concerned. You know, this is an e-waste dump in Ghana, and it's one of several images that I find quite haunting, because you know, 50 million tons of e-waste were dumped in developing nations by Western societies last year. And, of course, e-wastes, they have massive amounts of heavy metals and arsenic, mercury, very dangerous and very toxic chemicals. And these people, scavenge and create, obviously a living from, retrieving this. But at the same time, are being exposed to incredibly dangerous conditions. And the fact that this really is a product of, of Western dumping, I find really, ethically and morally very disturbing. And, for one, I mean, as an individual, taking the step of having like a, 6-year-old smartphone, I don't even think it's called a smartphone anymore. It's more of a dumb phone. It does what I require, but nothing else. But, it's working and functional for me. I don't need the latest and greatest. So, making that sort of ethical decision of everybody doing a small amount, in some way can affect, this sort of activity, which I think is, morally unsatisfactory.
Absolutely. And we've got a query or question from our participants relating to how we make this conversation sort of relevant and embed it in, for example, a higher education setting. So it feels that our conversation is really trying to illuminate that when we're speaking about digital literacy, actually we're putting feelers out into every aspect of our personal and professional lives. We're talking about social issues, political issues, environmental issues indeed. So how do we pull some of this narrative and make it resonate with what people are already studying, let's say in a university setting, any given discipline? How do we start to pull this into that context?
I mean, that's it's an excellent question and very challenging. I mean, I don't pretend to have the answer here. I don't think there is an answer that sort of covers every base. Universities particularly are very slow-moving beasts, very traditional often in their view of curriculum and assessment and so on, and often very siloed. So, people who exist in a particular discipline are very concerned about their delivery of their conceptual content knowledge aligned with their discipline, and often it's associated with very summative and traditional assessments. It's interesting because universities in some ways kind of, especially undergraduate level, not so much at postgraduate, I think act as, almost the antithesis of an environment to produce digitally literate students or digitally literate citizens. By the nature of the compliant nature of curriculum and the move towards standardized assessment, this applies to schools as well. Examination-based assessment really doesn't allow students to exercise digital literacy skills. It asks them to reproduce, if you look at the kind of Bloom's taxonomy at the bottom end, you've got remembering and recall. It really asks them to produce outcomes that are really associated with that lower level of cognitive processing. Whereas digital literacy capabilities exist at the top end, so evaluating and synthesizing information, creating new information artifacts and so on. And the way universities work and function, celebrating the recall of basic, domain knowledge doesn't really help kids or students' information literacy capabilities at all. So, we're being told, build these capabilities in our students, yet the environment in which, we provide them doesn't really promote that. So, I mean, in answer to your question, I don't have a magic wand there. I really do wish I did. I have conversations with my faculty about, how I'm an education faculty. We should be looking very seriously at this. I talk to the social science people, and I talk to the science people, and I talk to the health and well-being faculty, because this is all interdisciplinary. These are all interdisciplinary concerns. They don't exist in a single discipline. But the way universities work in their boxes and silos, it is incredibly challenging, and with the very content-pressured curriculum that needs to be delivered, often there just isn't space for it. So it's a very challenging thing, but you've got to keep trying. Never give up. You've got to keep plugging away. You've got to have, one of those 21st century competencies is resilience and persistence. And an ability to to stand up for something. What's the old saying? If you don't stand for anything, you fall for everything. So unless you develop that attitude and just try making a small difference in the environment you're in, then nothing's going to change. And at the end of the day, we've got a lot to lose.
Absolutely. And that's something that we've really been seeking to, I suppose, encourage with the literacy lab, is this idea that it's not going to take just one body, one individual, or indeed, even if that individual has a lot of clout, it really requires us each in our localities to invest in our sort of skills and knowledge and act as the real advocates and champions.
Emma, I've got real sort of faith in the millennials and the generation post 2000. If you look at and this is where digital technologies are really powerful and positive. You look at the school movement around climate change, that world movement that ended up in self-organized protests right around the world, organized by high school students and young people, through social media. And that is, to me, is a fantastic use of digital technologies to raise awareness that they are concerned about what's going on, and they're going to inherit the world that we're leaving a mess behind with. So I think, all power to them, to be honest, all power to them. And I had to, I had a bit of a laugh. I was watching Michael Moore's 11/9 the other day on TV, and there were these students out protesting, and it was around gun control, and it'd been organised through social media, and there was this principal with this bullhorn standing in the middle of the paddock telling the kids to get back to class because it was supposed to be in their timetable class, and these students were out there protesting about something that really mattered to them. And I think there's far more significant learning opportunities and social action opportunities and activities like that. And I think, technologies, that's to me, in my mind, that's technology for a positive outcome.
Interesting. And we've got another couple of reflections coming through on the forum. One, I suppose, picking up on this higher education question, how do we communicate digital literacy or try and embed it? And the query is, do we look to the home as the site of education and learning and support parents? And then paired with that, we have a colleague over in Scandinavia highlighting that actually there, digital literacy is something that is part of teacher training and embedded within the education system. So I suppose we've got 2 points there. One, should we be looking to the home? And 2, should we be looking to models that are already out there for us as educators to learn from and implement as appropriate in our own geographies?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. The education, or the process of education, the lines between home and school are being blurred, continually blurred. If you look at, I come from a school teaching background, and even when I was teaching, it wasn't that long ago, but it was a few years ago. Schools were being assigned increasing loads of social training, social education of students, looking after well-being issues, psychological issues, and so on and so forth. And although I'm saying that, I think the COVID-19 situation is an interesting one, because I think if there is some kind of a potential silver lining from this awful situation we're in at the moment, and that is it may foster a greater understanding of how parents and teachers can work together in partnerships to further the knowledge of and learning of students. Each have a critical role. There's a lot of research around the importance of parents as first teachers. After they reach 5 or 6, that role often is outsourced to schools. And parents, rightly or wrongly, breathe a sigh of relief and say, here's your lunchbox. But I don't think we can go down that road after COVID-19. I think there's probably going to be, hopefully a greater partnership and understanding between home and school. So I don't think we can outsource this to parents at all. Certainly there's opportunity to collaborate, but schools have a responsibility here. If you look at information literacy as a concept, it really should be embedded in any learning experience that the kids at schools and at universities should engage in. What is good information literacy? In my mind, it's the ability of an individual to harvest, synthesize, and make knowledge from diverse information, and turn that knowledge, turn that wisdom into productive, ethical and productive outcomes, not just economic outcomes or wealth outcomes, but social outcomes, environmental outcomes, and so on. So that, at the core to me of information literacy is metacognition. Metacognition, the use of higher order thinking skills, evaluating information, synthesizing information, analyzing information. That really is at the core of an information literate individual. But then you've got to surround that with, conditions which, kind of influence the operationalization, if you like, of that literacy. So I see competence as being bigger. I see competence as almost being kind of the ethical enactment of literacy. So it's how that's applied, to different environments for different purposes that turns a literacy into a competence. So to me, it's not just a simple technical exercise. I think it's far broader than that. And, those ethical and moral dimensions need to come in with it, because we can be information literate, but turn that capability to very negative purposes. And I think if my next slide, I think, is an example of that, actually, Emma, if we want to move on to that one. Now, this young lady is Phoebe Prince. She is was an Irish immigrant, went to South Hadley School in Massachusetts in the US. And the reason I've got that up here is because it's around the 10th anniversary of Phoebe's death by suicide. She was the first prosecuted case of cyberbullying. And she was mercilessly preyed upon by schoolmates. She was a recent immigrant. She wanted to be part of the group that was resented, and eventually, after months of torment, she took her own life. And to me, this was the first, the response of the government of Massachusetts, the governor. The response to this was huge. There was a massive outcry in the community and in the state, and it did lead to legislative changes which effectively defined cyberbullying as a crime and specified, what constitutes cyberbullying. So to me, Phoebe's death was tragic, but it's also, something's come from it in terms of the legislative framework. But of course, incredibly difficult to enforce. And by today's standards, probably too liberal, given the nature of means, if you like, of bullying that's now available to individuals.
And I suppose here we sort of teeter on the question of responsibility and where responsibility lies for when things particularly go wrong online. And we did have a query from a colleague close by in Bath here over in the UK about how we think about integrity online, academic integrity, how those in positions of authority or seem to be in positions of authority in our sort of sites of learning, how their responsibility to help us navigate through all of this, and also holding, I suppose, some of these platforms to account, which of course is increasingly happening in our current times. And there's been huge sort of volte-face U-turns over the past few months in particular because of this question of responsibility, and indeed how we see that our online interactions bleeding so heavily and unfortunately in many cases into our everyday lives.
Exactly. And I think, even go back to Phoebe's case, there was, even though the students were found guilty, they weren't found guilty with criminal responsibility, which I think is a tragedy. So where do the lines of that responsibility lie? And universities, academic integrity and and so on is a big issue. And of course, you have AI solutions like Turnitin that can be of great assistance there. But there's responsibilities for academic staff to teach students exactly what is expected and show them the correct processes for acknowledging references, and sources, citations, and so on. And also, there are cultural differences here, so we need to be very aware that in some cultures, directly copying, if you like, as an academic's work is actually not seen as plagiarism. It's seen as acknowledging and respecting the knowledge of that individual. So it's not an easy single answer solution to that problem. But everything lands on the table of education, and coming to university undergraduates, I'm really surprised at how little they actually understand about academic integrity and what that actually means, and how they can ensure that what they produce is their own work. I mean, in my postgraduate classes, I don't really have a lot of plagiarizable work. An assessment method I very strongly favour is in postgraduate seminars, where they produce, they present live to others. And we've been doing it this year online, and they need to, that way you can actually get a far greater understanding of the depth of knowledge of someone when they have to get up and explain to others, rather than necessarily write it in words on a page. So it's been not only enjoyable, but in terms of building a learning community, it's been incredibly powerful. But from an assessment perspective, I've learned so much more about what those students know than I would ever have done in the essay. And of course, technology facilitates that so much better, because you can use different forms of data. You can use visual data, statistical data, textual data, video, you name it, multimodal information. And it's really kind of celebrating the capabilities of the technology to represent understanding in different ways, other than just what's written on a page.
Absolutely. And the question of assessment's an important one, of course, isn't it? Is in that, we're always looking for measures, and often we want quantitative measures for learning, and that seems to have been privileged by many governments and how they have set up education systems. And yet in this field, we suddenly find, how do we assess, how do we judge how someone has advanced? How do we connect up that assessment so that it doesn't become this abstract sort of jumping through hoop exercise to something that's real world and maintains relevance and helps bridge that gap between the education context and once you're in the real world and you're in your professional setting, or personal setting, or wherever it might be.
I mean, that's about authenticity, and it worries me a bit, and you've raised a good point there, but it worries me that, the way that tertiary education, university education is moving, very large numbers of students in classes, just for economic reasons, really undermines the type of authentic assessment we've been arguing for. For example, if you've got 200 or 300 or 400, one of my colleagues has got 900 students in a class. And, and I said, how do you manage that? And he said, well, we do lots of quizzes. But if you look at, AI marked quizzes or self-marking quizzes, and I said, quizzes really only are able to evaluate a certain type of information, a certain type of knowledge. How does that? He said, well, I don't have enough markers to actually delve too much more deeply into that. It's not obviously the whole of the assessment. Obviously, there are, human marked components to it. But, to make that a it's a real challenge, unless you have an army of support. But unfortunately, those AI and auto produced and marked things are very useful for for evaluating certain types of information. They might work really well in scientific disciplines, mathematics or science, whatever, when knowledge isn't quite so contested. But in social sciences, where those kind of lines blur a little more, it's really problematic.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that actually the question of quizzes is to bring a bit of meta commentary on this sort of initiative. It's something that we hotly debated, because similarly we understand, you know, with if you've got a course, a program of learning, people do want to feel that they're being sort of tested and encouraged to look back and reflect on their learning. But indeed, as you say, with these multiple choice quizzes, how do we can we really understand what an individual has garnered from course material, and is that, you know, is it a useful exercise?
Well, if you look at, you know, multiple choice selections, it's right at the bottom of that thinking pyramid. You know, it's recall,
yes,
remember.
absolutely.
It's lower cognition. You know, and once again, is that the type of skill that our kids, our students need? I mean, information is plentiful. You can go, information is at your fingertips and in your pocket. What's not in your pocket is knowledge. You know, turning information into knowledge is a cognitive process. So it involves a level of, you know, synthesis and understanding and cognitive, you know, cognitive loading, if you like. Yes. That transfers raw data and information into wisdom, you know, through a process of knowledge construction. Whereas if we're only recalling, you know, isolated facts, I don't know about your secondary schooling, Emma, but my secondary schooling was infuriating because that's all we did.
Oh yes, plenty of drilling.
Yeah, we had to remember. I mean, it wasn't a test of knowledge, it was a test of remembering. You know, it was that the person with the best memory got the best result, not the person who knew the most. So, you know, as soon as you'd finish that exam, it was all out the window anyway, and you wondered what the point was.
Oh yes, absolutely. I hope no one presents me with a biology paper tomorrow. Really, a really interesting dichotomy, Garry, that you set up, information versus knowledge, because I think one of the areas that are so hotly contested when we talk about digital literacy and competencies is there's this knowledge versus skills debate, and people plonk, I suppose, digital literacy, oh, it's a skill that's a bit abstract, and actually we need to really drill knowledge, whereas actually what's coming out, I think, of this conversation is that, or rather that, as you've really helpfully highlighted, that actually we're talking about information versus the skill of the knowledge of what you do with that information.
I mean, information, you know, being information literate will enable you to be more knowledgeable. There's no question about it, because it will allow you to work with information more effectively. It'll enable you to understand how to use devices to get information. It'll enable you to sift that information, sorting the wheat from the chaff. It'll enable you to understand different forms of information and data and put that together. And out of that, you know, you will construct some view or some knowledge artifact. But hopefully, you know, which hopefully is reasonably reflective of reality. But you know, if we can't assume, you know, devices are knowledge devices. You know, computer isn't a knowledge device; it's an information device. You know, computer doesn't know anything; it just helps you know something. So, you know, but those skills which you described, you know, as information literacy skills, it's kind of the engine that drives knowledge creation. But they aren't the same thing.
Yes, and so important to underline, and I think that's something that's really come through in the forum and the discussions and reflection from different geographies, is this need to shift the narrative, because I think that really clouds understanding of, number one, what we're actually talking about, and two, how to implement it. And
absolutely.
And with regard to that second point of sort of implementation and maintaining relevance and marrying theory and practice, and another query that's come through is this idea of how we really bridge that gap between education and then people graduating and being able to articulate what their skill set, their knowledge set is, and how they communicate that that's relevant to an employment setting.
Yeah.
So that, for quite a tricky issue to sort, I think.
Yeah, it is, but, you know, it has a relatively straightforward answer. I mean, if, you know, produce outcomes and artifacts from a university education, that makes sense to employers. that may seem common sense. But if you look at learning, as a journey, and along the way you pick up pieces of evidence that, indicate that journey and are reflective of your learning through that journey. Whereas at the moment, we have a very heavy emphasis on summative outcomes, learning at the end of something rather than learning during something. And of course, showing the prospective employer a transcript, with an A on it, they're going to shrug their shoulders and say, well, what does that A actually mean? Whereas if you show them a portfolio of evidence accumulated over time that will demonstrate what that A really does mean in tangible and recognizable evidence and outcomes, then that's going to make a lot more sense. And of course, digital technologies enable that so beautifully, because as I said before, they can allow us to assemble and create information artifacts that are incredibly illustrative and very authentic. That really define, they say, okay, you want an A at the end of it, have an A at the end of it, that's fine. But this is what the A means. It's not just an A. Or in my case, a C.
And I suppose in that sense, if we have this portfolio of projects, actually it facilitates the ability of understanding different knowledge levels and digital literacy competencies, if we can call it that, in different localities and from different settings. And I think that seems to be one of the real sticking points, perhaps, to bring us back to a digital literacy theory and practice and how we embed it in education systems is not only different understandings, different definitions, but as you say, what does the A mean? What does this mark mean? Or out of 9 or A star or whatever it might be, that it really makes it very difficult to compare one individual's work with another.
I mean, the grade is not evidence. The grade is just a grade.
Yeah.
Evidence is something you can see and make a judgment on. What an A means is or whatever grade it is not defined, and certainly not visible to most people. And everybody knows it's great that you got an A, but what? So what? What can you actually do? Show me.
Exactly. Absolutely. Shall we move forward, Garry, to your next?
Oh yeah, sure. Oh look, yeah, you've got
we've got
you can put the next two up if you like, Emma. Yeah, those two.
These two.
Oh, you put all three up. Why not? No, that's all right. Put all three up. That's a great idea. Okay. Yeah, no, that's. I mean, I'm an original fanboy of Seymour Papert. I don't know if any people in the out there inside the land, are aware of Seymour Papert. But Seymour Papert worked for MIT, and he was a psychologist who did some absolutely amazing work at MIT in the 70s and 80s. He developed probably the earliest coding program called Logo. And it was based on a constructionist theory where learning happens through interaction with artifacts and physical and virtual environments. And when I was teaching in my classrooms, I did a lot of work with Logo with my year 6 kids. They're about 9 and 10-year-olds. And I was amazed, absolutely incredibly amazed at the cognitive processing of kids when they were using Logo. And Logo it's a very basic programming program. Originally you had a triangle and you had basic kind of commands of forwards, backwards, right turn, left turn, and it kind of left a trace on the screen as it went. You could draw circles and squares and so on, and you could set challenges. And it was actually evolved into a turtle, and I think it went into Logo Micro Worlds, which was kind of added a bit of context to it. It wasn't so much in the outcome that the kids produced, it was in the process that was they involved in actually getting there. And I, for my PhD, recorded some of these kids using, not in my class, but in my research class, using Logo in classrooms. And I was just amazed at the rich conversations and the higher order thinking skills that those kids were actually applying to the task. And also the competencies of negotiation and problem solving and compromise and trial and error and reflection, all of those sort of 21st century competencies we've been talking about, are all embedded in this terrific task. So if you haven't had a read of any of Seymour Papert's work, he unfortunately passed away a few years ago now, but in my mind, he was probably one of the greatest educational theorists of our time. and a very humble man at that. His first book, Mindstorms, really sort of sets the framework for the logo and the sort of educational and cognitive rationale that underpins it. Whereas this 1993 book, The Children's Machine, the middle one, really challenges the traditional notion of school and what it stands for, and whether it's delivering the sort of education that our kids are going to need going forward. And it was really well before its time. What I find really fascinating at the moment, Emma, is this whole move in compulsory education towards coding. And everywhere you go, there's a code club, or there is a code consultant or a coding teacher or whatever. And it's all associated with basically the whole kind of discourse of we need more coders. Probably the world, maybe the world does need more coders, but it doesn't need everybody to be a coder. You can imagine how boring the world would be if everybody turned out and wanted to do computer coding. That would be horrific. But it denies the underpinning computational base to coding, which is effectively a cognitive problem-solving process. And the value of getting kids to engage in that is teaching them to think. And this book, The Children's Machine, was years ahead of its time. These conversations are happening now, but it sets the platform for that discussion around whether schools really are equipping kids for the future. The last one there, Julie Albright's book, it's a new read. It's 2009, and I picked it up and I had a quick look at the cover and the inside. And I thought that's really interesting because I really like it. I'm only halfway through, but I've read the first bit, and it's she's really building a thesis, an argument around digital technologies as being incredibly divisive devices. She kind of used the word disconnection by connection. So she argues that, she puts it in the context of the American dream, this kind of whole notion of, living in utopia and being united by a sense of community and so on, which we know is, pretty much a myth anyway. But she says, digital technologies are setting up generations of isolated groups, who exist in echo chambers of their own creation and don't mix and don't interact. So we're losing the sense of community. We have communities, but we're losing a sense of community. And, she's really concerned about that in terms of the long-term effects on society and the whole notion of what society as a collective actually means and stands for. So the other two parts of her book are the internet, she's labelled the internet of me, which is interesting, and the internet of them, and it starts to explore, smart technologies and how smart technologies, respond and can be personalised, but also how that data that they store and produce and sometimes share could be used against us. And the internet of them is really moving into AI, artificial intelligence, and alerting to some of the ethical and moral dilemmas that are associated with increased use of AI. So I recommend those three books. Quite different. Well, the first two are quite similar. If you like sort of a strong, provocative read, I really think Julie Albright's book is worth a look. Maybe if we do another seminar sometime, I can report back on the ending.
Yes, absolutely. And a very interesting point, perhaps, as we start to wrap up the session and pull out some of the salient points that we've alighted on through our to and fro. And thank you so much to everyone for coming in with some very interesting reflections, points of information and questions. And of course, we've been talking about some digital crises, perhaps we could call it, with the very sad case of cyberbullying. And of course, we could bring forward so many more examples of this and spoken about where the responsibility lies. And that has also brought us to some of these conversations of how we really articulate what it means to be digitally literate and what it means when you're not and when that goes wrong. And yet at the same time, of course, as some of our attendees right now are pointing out, and of course is being pointed out on the forum, a huge portion of the world aren't connected. And in times like our own, we're just widening that chasm between the educational haves and the educational have-nots. and huge amounts of confusion and concern between all communities, really, those who do have access and how we can reach more people, and those without, how they're being left behind. And still this question of how we can really boil down what it could be to be offer digital literacy and digital access as simply as possible. As one person has really nicely put it, thank you, the aged fear it, the youth love it. We could probably extend on a debate for another hour as to whether there is this sort of so-called digital native, digital immigrant divide. But we've had indeed this concern about whether we need to think about digital literacy as the essential 21st century skill when we're still lacking that infrastructure in so many places. And indeed, speaking from the UK, we've got our own, perhaps not to the same extent, but there's a huge divide here equally, with the business of education being so disrupted. So if I may, we're coming to a close. We have a few minutes left of our session. If I could bring us back round to how we set this up and framed it. And we said we'd speak about digital literacy as the essential 21st century skill. And I suggested maybe we'll put a question mark at the end of that. So Garry, if I could invite you to make some closing comments on whether we have, is it indeed that essential 21st century skill, and how, if so, what are the next couple of steps we can all individually, wherever we may be, take to start deepening understanding and implementing something that leads towards digital literacy enablement?
I mean, it's a really good question. I suppose we've kind of talked around in a bit of a circle, but it's you know, going back to your previous point, you know, about divides, and of course you can only be digitally literate if you have access to certain devices or technologies that'll support that. And you know, the digital divide is huge right across the world in terms of access to technologies, but also in so-called developed countries, there's an emerging divide around quality of use. So despite the fact that there is, you know, plenty of technology in many developed countries, you know, people have got devices coming out of their ears. The divide is, you know, to the extent to which their digital literacies will allow them to take advantage, you know, for productively use those devices for different purposes, and whether the use is simply very narrow and very focused and very self-centered. So, you know, there's that kind of productive divide versus, you know, the others. And, you know, there's ethical dimensions involved in that as well. I think it would be a very weak argument to say that digital literacy isn't an essential competency or essential future skill. But I preface that by saying we're in an unfortunate situation that that may not necessarily be a condition achievable by all states and all nations, which I think is tragic. You know, if we're looking at the, you know, from a social justice point of view, from an equity point of view, you know, to what extent are the divides impacting upon people's ability to leverage, you know, personal, social, environmental, and economic benefits from technology. And unfortunately, the gap is getting bigger. But even the gap within countries that do have access is getting bigger. And it's not on access, you know, and it's not on device access, it's around use. So we've got gaps in both contexts that we really need to work hard at. So, you know, what's the next step? Well, first of all, never give up. You know, if you're working in a university or if you're in government, you know, policy development, you know, maybe think about some of these things. They're very important aspects. And if you're looking at a holistic view of digital competence, you know, please don't just narrow it to technical capabilities. You know, consider the other aspects of what digital competence means beyond the technical.
Thank you. So I think what we've brought us round to, if I may pull on that word holistic, Garry, that you just use there, is that really we need a connected approach, that digital literacy is an essential skill, and yet it ties up and resonates with all of these other sort of very human skills of communication, collaboration, the resilience and persistence. And meanwhile, we have sitting in the background and thinking about this idea of connectedness, is that when we're thinking about digital literacy, actually we're thinking about digital infrastructure and ability to not only open up that infrastructure, but use it once we've got it in front of us. So it's not just having digital access, but it's knowing what to do with the very powerful devices and access to such reams of information and data that we can be given. We're now an hour in. It's been a real pleasure. Garry, thank you so much, as I say, for joining us and for helping us stimulate such a really relevant and timely discussion around digital literacy. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us from the UK and every other continent bar. I think we don't have a representation from Antarctica yet, but perhaps coming in another webinar. Thank you so much to everyone. We'll sign off now. Enjoy the rest of your days and rest of your weeks. And I look forward to engaging further with those of you who are within the MOOC, and look forward to also seeing you perhaps in a further webinar.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you.